The candles had been lit for a celebration, though no one seated at the long table at Ravenscar Hall seemed inclined to remember it. 200 flames burned along the silver branches, and their light fell on porcelain and crystal and the cold, ancient faces of a family that had gathered to watch a stranger fail. Eleanor sat where they had placed her, at the very foot of that endless table, below the great silver salt cellar shaped like a leaping stag, below the salt. She had read the phrase once in an old book and thought it only a saying. Now she understood that it was a place, a real and deliberate place, and that a woman could be put there in her own home on the very night she became its mistress. They had married her that morning. She was, from 11 o'clock, the Duchess of Blackthorne, and at 8 in the evening they had seated her among the poor cousins and the elderly aunts, as though she were a governess permitted, for once, to dine with the family she served. At the head of the table, so far away that candle smoke blurred him, sat her husband, Adrian, 4th Duke of Blackthorne. He had not looked at her since the church. He did not look at her now. "Do tell us," said the woman at his right hand, in a voice pitched to carry the whole length of the room. "Is it true one can still smell the mills upon a person?" "I confess, I have never been near one. I should not know." That was Lady Cordelia, the Duke's aunt, a woman of 60, with a spine like a fire iron and a smile like the edge of a knife. The table tittered on cue. Somewhere near the middle, a young man laughed outright, then remembered himself. Eleanor set down her fork. She was aware of every eye that pretended not to be upon her. She was aware of the heat rising in her throat and the tremor she would not allow into her hands. She thought of her father's counting-house, of the smell of ink and tallow and honest wool, of the men who had built with their 2 hands the fortune that had bought this ancient roof out of ruin that very morning. She thought, "They eat tonight because of that smell." "I could not say, my lady," Eleanor answered, and her voice came out clear and even and low. "I have never had the leisure to sit idle long enough to notice what I carry. Perhaps your ladyship has." The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that meant a blow had landed. Lady Cordelia's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes did, and far away at the head of the table, for the length of a single heartbeat, the Duke of Blackthorne raised his gaze from his wine and looked at the woman he had married for her money, and scorned before she had finished her soup. He looked at her, and then he looked away, and said nothing at all. Eleanor picked up her fork. The soup had gone cold. She ate it anyway, every spoonful, slowly, while the great house pressed its silence down upon her like a stone laid over a grave. She did not weep. She had promised herself, in the carriage that morning, that whatever they did to her, she would not weep where they could see it. So she sat below the salt in her wedding silk, and she made herself a vow instead. If this was to be her cage, then she would learn every bar of it. She would learn its locks and its hinges, and the weak place in its mortar. And one day, though she did not yet know how, she would not sit at the foot of this table. She would sit wherever in this house she chose. To understand how a mill owner's daughter came to be scorned at a duke's table, you must go back 3 months, to a warm office in Manchester, where the whole of it was arranged over brandy, without her. Eleanor Vane was the only child of Josiah Vane, and Josiah Vane was rich in the new way, the way the old families despised and could not do without. He had begun with 1 loom and a great deal of nerve, and he now owned mills and warehouses and a fleet of barges on the canal, and a house so full of marble that it echoed. He loved his daughter more than all of it. He had also decided, with the same iron certainty that had made his fortune, that his money was not enough. He wanted a name for her. He wanted his grandchildren to have blood the world could not sneer at. And the Duke of Blackthorne wanted money. For the Blackthorne estate was dying. The old Duke, Adrian's father, had died the winter before and left behind him a mountain of debt so vast that the family solicitors spoke of it in whispers. Ravenscar Hall, seat of the dukedom for 400 years, was mortgaged to the roof beams. The tenant farms were failing. There was talk, quiet, unbearable talk, of selling the London house, of selling the paintings, at last of selling the land itself, acre by ancient acre, until nothing was left of the Blackthornes but a title and a debt. Josiah Vane offered a bargain to save them both. His fortune, whole and immediate, poured into the estate to clear every debt and stop every mouth, in exchange for one thing that money alone could never buy. His daughter made a duchess. Trade married into the peerage. Eleanor learned of it the way she learned of most decisions, after they were made. Her father came to her in the small parlour where she kept his private ledgers, for she had kept his books since she was 14 and had a head for figures that had frightened 3 separate tutors, and he told her she was to marry a duke. He was flushed with the triumph of it, and in his pride he said a thing he thought a compliment. "And I'll tell you what sweetened it at the last, Nell," he said, beaming, when the solicitors were haggling. "I told them plain, my daughter keeps my books better than any clerk in Manchester, and manages my under-managers besides." That gave them pause, I can tell you. A duke wants a duchess who can hold a great house together, not some painted miss who faints at a column of figures. Your cleverness helped buy your coronet, my girl. Think of that. Eleanor had thought little of it then. She had been too busy learning she was to be sold. She would remember it later. She would remember it far too well. She might have refused. She had thought about it all that night, sitting up in the dark. But a woman of her time had very little to refuse with. She could not earn her own bread. She could not hold her own property. If she defied her father, she would be a burden and a scandal. And when he died, she would be handed like a parcel to some cousin who would resent the feeding of her. A husband was the only door out of her father's house, and every door led into some man's keeping. At least this one led up. So she said yes, and she meant this by it, though she told no one. "I will go where you send me, but I will not go as a lamb. Whatever this duke thinks he has not bought me." She brought 2 things with her to Ravenscar that no one had thought to forbid: a trunk of plain wool gowns beneath the wedding silk, and a mind sharpened on 20 years of honest accounts, coiled and waiting, that the whole of Blackthorne's world assumed a woman could not possess. The Duke of Blackthorne, for his part, had not wanted a wife at all. He stood at the tall window of his study the night after the wedding dinner, a glass of his father's brandy untouched in his hand, and he despised himself with a thoroughness that had become, that year, as familiar to him as breathing. That was the plain truth, beneath all the polite words the solicitors used. His father had gambled and speculated and drunk the estate into its grave, and Adrian, who had loved the land with a fierce and private love since he was a boy, had faced a simple and terrible choice. Let Ravenscar fall, let 400 years of his blood scatter to auctioneers, let his tenants be turned off their farms into a hard world, or sell the one thing left to sell, which was his name, and his hand, and his freedom. He had chosen the land. He would always choose the land. But he had not forgiven himself for the price, and because he could not strike at himself, he had struck, coldly and without honor, at her. He knew it. That was the shameful part. He had watched his aunt seat his bride below the salt, and he had said nothing. He had watched Cordelia bait her about the mills, and he had said nothing. He had told himself that a man in his position could not be seen to defend a tradesman's daughter, that the ton was watching, that his family's pride was all he had left, and he must guard it. And all the while, a smaller, truer voice had said, "Coward, she has saved everything you love, and you let them spit upon her because you cannot bear that you needed saving." He had expected her to weep. Women of his acquaintance wept prettily and often, and he had braced himself for tears and reproaches, and a long, cold marriage of mutual complaint. She had not wept. She had answered Cordelia so evenly that the whole table felt the sting, and then she had eaten her cold soup with the composure of a queen, and looked at no one, and asked nothing of anybody. He had found, to his intense discomfort, that he could not stop thinking about it. There had been something in her stillness that was not weakness at all, something that had looked, for a moment, very much like a woman taking the measure of a room she meant one day to own. He drank the brandy then, in one swallow, and told himself he had imagined it. She was a burden he would house and clothe and be civil to, and in time she would settle into the country and trouble him little. He was wrong about all of it. He simply did not know yet how wrong. The first weeks at Ravenscar taught Eleanor the shape of her cage. It was a beautiful cage. She would grant it that. The hall stood on the edge of the northern moors, grey stone and tall chimneys, and 100 windows that looked out over heather and stone walls, and a sky that changed its mind 6 times an hour. When the rain came, it came sideways, and the wind found every gap in the old casements, and sang through them all night like something mourning. When the sun came, the whole moor turned to gold and copper, and Eleanor, who had grown up in the smoke of a great town, stood at her window and could not breathe for the beauty of it. But the beauty was not for her. She was given a suite in the east wing and left in it. No one dined with her but the servants who brought her trays. Lady Cordelia had appointed herself the mistress of the house long before Eleanor arrived, and ran it still, ordering the meals and receiving the callers, all with an air of managing an inconvenient guest, who would soon, it was to be hoped, go home. The Duke rode out at dawn, and returned at dark, and dined, when he dined at the hall at all, in a silence so complete that Eleanor stopped attending. The ton would not receive her. Word of the marriage had run through the drawing rooms of 3 counties, and the verdict was unanimous. The Duke of Blackthorne had married a mill girl to save his estate, and one did not call upon mill girls, however grand their new titles. Invitations came for the Duke, and pointedly, not for his wife. She might have folded into that silence and let it bury her. Instead, Eleanor did the thing she had always done when the world grew too small around her. She went looking for work, and she found it, of all places, in the estate office. It stood at the end of a stone passage off the old kitchens, a low room with a great oak table and shelves that sagged under 40 years of ledgers, and it was ruled by a man named Silas Crabbe. Crabbe had been the estate's steward for 30 years, first under the late Duke and now under the young one, and he had the soft, careful voice of a man who has never once been questioned. He was surprised to find the new Duchess in his doorway on a wet Tuesday morning. He was less pleased than surprised. "Your Grace," he said, rising, spreading one broad hand over the open ledger before him, as though to shield it from a draught. "You are lost, I think. The house is the other way." "I am not lost, Mr. Crabbe. I have come to see the accounts." Something crossed his face and was gone. "The accounts are a dry business, Your Grace. Rents and repairs and the price of seed corn. Nothing to interest a lady." "I find I am interested in a great many things that are not supposed to interest a lady," Eleanor said pleasantly, and sat down across from him without being asked, and folded her hands and waited. He did not show her the ledgers that day. He showed her a summary, a single fair page in a fine clerk's hand, full of round numbers and reassuring words, and he talked over her questions in his soft, careful voice until she rose and left, and he thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was the beginning. For Eleanor had spent 20 years across a table from men who wished to hide the true state of their affairs behind a fair page and a soft voice, and she knew the smell of it the way a fisherman knows weather. She had seen, in the moment before Crabbe covered it, the real ledger beneath his hand, and its columns had not been fair or round at all. They had been crabbed and crowded and full of small corrections, and one figure among them, a figure for the roof lead of the south barns, had been so large and so wrong that it had lodged in her mind like a splinter. She did not accuse anyone. She was far too clever for that, and far too alone. She began, quietly, to learn her cage. She befriended Mrs. Halloway, the housekeeper, an upright woman worn thin by years of managing an impossible house on money that never came, and Mrs. Halloway, starved of anyone who would listen, told her a great deal. She walked out onto the tenant farms in her plain wool gowns, and sat in the kitchens of the men who worked the land, and drank their weak tea, and listened. She learned which cottages had roofs, and which had holes. She learned that the Dawes family up on the high field had been promised repairs for 3 winters, and seen none, though the ledger she had glimpsed showed the roof lead paid for twice over. She learned the true price of seed corn in that country, which was a good deal less than the estate was somehow paying. And in the long, empty evenings, when the great house had gone silent, and the Duke was shut in his study, and Lady Cordelia had retired to plot the next season's slights, Eleanor lit a single candle in her room, and did the one thing she had always been able to do better than anyone expected. She reckoned. The Duke found her out by accident, on a night the storm came in off the moor, and would not let the house sleep. He could not rest that night. He never could when the wind rose like that, for it made the old house groan like a ship, and it stirred up things in him he preferred to keep still. He went down to the library at 2 in the morning for a book he did not want, and he found the door already ajar and a light within. Eleanor sat at the great library table, with the estate ledgers open before her. Not the fair summaries, the real books, the crabbed and crowded ones, which she must have carried out of Crabbe's office when he was gone, and around her lay a battlefield of paper, covered in columns of her own neat figures. She had a smudge of ink upon her cheek, and her dark hair had come half down, and she was so wholly absorbed that she did not hear him at first. He stood in the doorway and simply watched her. He had never once, in 3 months of marriage, seen her look like this. At the dinners, she was a still, cold mask. Here she was alive. Her lips moved as she reckoned. Her finger ran down a column, and stopped and tapped, and her whole face lit with a fierce, private satisfaction that did something strange to his chest. "You will ruin your eyes," he said, and she looked up, and the light went out of her face at once, and he was sorry he had spoken. "Your Grace," she began to gather the papers together, "forgive me, I could not sleep. You have been in Crabbe's office." "Yes." "Why?" She hesitated. He watched her weigh whether to lie to him and decide against it, and lift her chin in that way she had. "Because your estate is being robbed," she said, "and has been for some years, and I believe I can prove it." He should have laughed. A week before he would have laughed, but something in her steadiness stopped the laughter in his throat. He came into the room and sat down across from her, the storm walking up and down the roof above them, and he said, "Show me." She showed him. She showed him the roof lead paid for twice, and the roofs that still let in the rain. She showed him the price of seed corn set down at half again its worth, year upon year, the difference vanishing into nothing anyone could name. She showed him rents recorded as unpaid from tenants who swore on their children they had paid, and paid on time. She showed him a whole cottage row on the estate's western edge that appeared in the accounts as maintained, insured, and drawing wages for 2 men to keep it, and which she had walked to herself and found to be a heap of fallen stone, abandoned since before the old Duke died, housing nothing but rooks. She had built it, over weeks, patient stone by patient stone, into a wall of evidence he could not climb over. And at the top of it, at the place where all the small thefts gathered into one plain and terrible sum, stood a name. "Crabbe," the Duke said, His voice had gone very quiet. "Crabbe served my father for 30 years. Yes," Eleanor said gently. "And your father was a man too proud and then too sick to read his own accounts. 30 years is a very long time to steal from men who will not look. It was not your father's gambling alone that brought Ravenscar to its grave, your grace. It was this. It has been bleeding you for a generation, drop by drop, from a wound no one thought to search for." He sat with it. The storm boomed. She watched the anger move through him, and beneath the anger, something she had not expected to see in the Duke of Blackthorne, which was grief. Not for the money, for the years, for his father, dying in disgrace for a ruin that had been, in part, done to him by a trusted man. For the tenants left cold in leaking cottages, while the estate was built for roofs that were never laid. "Why?" he said at last, and she understood he did not mean Crabbe. He meant her. "You owe this house nothing. My family has treated you as, God forgive us, we have treated you, and you have spent your nights, alone, saving an estate that has given you nothing but a cold seat below the salt. Why?" Eleanor was quiet a moment. Outside, the storm had begun, at last, to soften. "Because I could not save myself," she said. "I did not choose to come here. I was sold to this house as surely as that seed corn, and for very much the same reason, that a man wanted something my father's money could buy. I cannot leave. The law will not let me hold a shilling of my own, or walk out of a door that is not opened for me. I have no escape from this cage. So I did the only thing I have ever been able to do when a wall would not fall. I set my shoulder to it, and I looked for the crack. I could not rise out of this place, so I resolved to rise within it, to make myself the one thing this house could not do without." She had not meant to say so much. She saw at once that it had struck him somewhere deep. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a country he had thought a wasteland, and discovers, too late to be wise about it, to be full of hidden rivers. "You should have been a general," he said. "I should have been a great many things," Eleanor answered, "if the world had let me be them. As it is, I am a duchess who is not permitted at her own dinner table, sitting up at 2 in the morning to catch a thief. We must all make do." And the Duke of Blackthorne, who had not laughed in a year, laughed. It surprised them both. He reached across the papers and turned the ledger toward himself and said, "Show me again, all of it. I want to understand every column before I face him." They sat together over the books until the candle guttered and the first grey light came up over the moor, two people on opposite sides of a great cold marriage, bent close over the truth of a thing, forgetting to remember that they were enemies. Catching Silas Crabbe was not the work of a night. He did not fall the way a guilty man falls in a story. He fought. When the Duke first put the question to him, Crabbe denied everything in his soft, steady voice and produced, within the day, a set of books so clean and so plausible that a less prepared man would have apologized for asking. Eleanor had expected exactly this. "He keeps 2 sets, she told Adrian, "the fair set for showing and the true set for stealing. We must find the true set, and we must find it before he burns it." They found that Crabbe had already begun to burn it. A servant reported smoke from the office grate on a day too warm for a fire. Whole quarters of the old accounts had gone missing from the shelves. The steward was covering his tracks, and he was clever, and he had 30 years of habit, and every advantage of a man who knows a house better than its master. But Eleanor knew a thing Crabbe did not know she knew. A thief who steals from the estate must hide the money somewhere the estate itself will show it. And she had learned, across 20 years of her father's affairs, that men who steal cannot bear to trust their gains to anyone but themselves. She sent quietly to a corn factor and a builder's merchant in the market town, honest men glad of the Duchess's custom, and she got from them their own records, the other side of every crooked bargain, receipts for corn never delivered at prices never paid, invoices for lead that had gone straight from the wagon to a yard Crabbe owned under another name. She matched them, line by line, to the fair books he had shown to save himself, and every falsehood he had told to clear his name became, in her hands, another nail. He knew, at the last, that he was finished, and a cornered man who cannot save himself will very often decide, instead, to wound. That was the part Eleanor had not foreseen, because she had been thinking of him as a problem in a ledger, and not as a man with 30 years of watching this family and a store of poison laid by against the day he might need it. The Duke dismissed him in the estate office, with the solicitor present and the evidence stacked upon the oak table, and Crabbe, stripped of every defence, turned his soft eyes upon Eleanor, who stood by the window, and he smiled. "You've done well, Your Grace," he said. "Better than any steward I ever trained. But then, that's why he had you, isn't it? That's what you were bought for. You didn't know? Oh." His smile widened at what he saw in her face. "Your own father told the Duke's men, at the settlement, told them his girl kept his books better than any clerk in Manchester, could hold a great house together, manage the managers. It was written into the terms, near enough, why they wanted you, and not some other rich man's daughter, not a bride. A steward that comes with her own dowry and takes no wages. His Grace here got the cleverest agent in the North Country and paid nothing for the keeping of her but a wedding ring. I'd have thought you'd worked that sum yourself, being so quick with figures. Good day to you both." And Silas Crabbe took his hat and walked out of Ravenscar Hall, 30 years a thief, ruined at last. And he left behind him, in the ruin, a single seed of poison, planted with a craftsman's care, in the one heart he could still reach. The Duke did not so much as glance at the words. He was too busy with his fury at the man to hear the shape of what had been said. "Pay him no mind," he told Eleanor, gathering the evidence. "He is a liar to the last breath. Do not let him leave you with anything." But Eleanor had gone very still by the window, because she had heard something in it that Adrian had not. She had heard her father's own voice. "Your cleverness helped buy your coronet, my girl. Think of that. Crabbe had not invented it. Crabbe had only known it, the way stewards know everything, and had chosen the truest and cruelest thing in the whole house to throw at her on his way out the door." She said nothing. She smiled, and agreed that he was a liar, and helped the Duke lock away the evidence. But the seed had found soil, and it began, that hour, to grow. For the next weeks were the sweetest of Eleanor's marriage, and the poison grew beneath them all the while. The Duke came to her, the night Crabbe was gone, not to her cold public place at the great table, but to the small east parlour, where she took her solitary supper, and he sat down across from her without ceremony, and said, "You might have let this house fall, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you saved it, alone, while it scorned you. I do not know how a man begins to make that right, but I should like to try. Will you dine with me? Not there. Here, away from all of them." She said yes. She should not have let herself be glad. But she was glad, and that was the trouble. They dined together the next night, and the next, in that small, warm room. He discovered she knew more of the practical management of land and money than any steward he had ever employed, and gave it freely, and asked nothing. She discovered that beneath his frozen pride was a man who loved his land with his whole heart, who knew every tenant's name and every child's, who had ridden out at dawn all those silent months, not to avoid her, but because the land was the only thing that did not despise him for what he had been forced to do. One grey afternoon they rode out together to the ruin of the Western cottages, the tumbled row that had been built and never built, and she stood among the fallen stones in her plain wool gown and showed him, course by course, exactly how they might be raised again for less than half what Crabbe had pretended to spend. "You put the new lintels here," she said, kneeling in the wet grass, without a thought for the silk beneath the wool. and you take the good stone from the old dairy that is past saving, and you set the doors boys to the carting, and you have 4 sound cottages before the frost, and you have paid a fair wage into your own tenant's hands, instead of into a thief's yard. He crouched beside her in the ruin, this duke of 400 years, and looked from her quick hands to her lit face, and said, "Where were you all my life?" And she laughed, and did not answer, and the wind came off the moor, and took the laugh away. At a stream a week later, he handed her down from her horse, and held her gloved hand a moment longer than the task required, and she did not take it back, and they stood there while the water ran over the stones, both very still, both looking at the water and not at each other, until a curlew cried across the moor and broke the spell. And at the harvest, the tenants held a supper in the great barn, and the Duke and Duchess went, and Eleanor danced. Not the careful hostile minuets of the tun, but a country reel with the door's eldest boy, laughing, her hair coming down, and the Duke stood at the edge of the lamplight and watched his wife spin in the arms of a farmer's son, watched the tenants love her because she had walked their fields and mended their roofs, and felt something in his chest crack clean open. When the music turned to a waltz, he crossed the barn floor before he had decided to, and took her with a bow, and put his hand at her waist, and danced with her himself. They had never touched so before. The whole barn watched. Eleanor's heart went so hard she was certain he could feel it through his glove. "You are staring at me, Your Grace," she said, "to have something to say." "I am," he admitted, unashamed. "I find I cannot seem to stop. And I wish, when we are alone, you would call me by my name, and not my title. I have begun to think my title is the worst thing about me, and you are the only person alive who might teach me otherwise." "Adrian," she said, trying it, and the word did something to his face, and for the length of one turn of the waltz, they were not a duke and a mill girl, not a bargain struck over brandy. They were only 2 people who had found, against every expectation, exactly the one other person in the world who could understand them. He drew her a fraction closer than the dance required. Her breath caught, his head began to bend toward hers. And then the music ended, and the barn burst into applause, and the moment shattered like a dropped glass, and they stepped apart, flushed, laughing unsteadily. But she carried it home with her through the dark, that nearness, and lay awake with the memory of his hand at her waist, and knew, with a plummeting certainty, that she had done the one thing she had sworn in the carriage on her wedding day she would never do. She had begun to love him, and it was precisely because she had begun to love him that Crab's seed could grow into something that might destroy her. For a woman who does not care cannot be poisoned by the question of why she is wanted. Only a woman in love lies awake, asking it. The question was this, and it grew in her, through those bright weeks, like a black weed beneath a flowering field. She had heard it first, from her father's own proud mouth, and again from a thief's cruel one, and she could not now unhear it. She had been chosen. Not taken sight unseen as any rich man's daughter might be, but chosen, named, specified, because she kept books better than any clerk, because she could hold a great house together, because a shrewd duke, drowning in a ruined estate, had wanted, above all things, someone to save it. Her cleverness had helped by her coronet. Her mind was not a delightful thing he had stumbled upon in a library at 2 in the morning. Her mind was the point of the purchase. And so how was she ever to know? A man does not fall in love with a steward he has bought. But a man might grow very warm indeed toward the woman who is, month by month, lifting the ruin off his shoulders. He might feel gratitude and relief, and the deep animal ease of a burden shared, and call it, in the privacy of his own untutored heart, something warmer. He needed her. She had made herself indispensable, exactly as she had vowed on the night she came, and she had succeeded, past all imagining, and now she could not tell his love from his need, and she began to believe she never would. She had set out to become the one possession the house could not do without, and she had become exactly that, and a thing that cannot be done without is still, for all that, a thing that was bought. She did the only thing she could think to do. She waited for her father's next visit, and she asked him, lightly, over the tea things, as though it were nothing. Was it true, what he had said, that her keeping of the books had swayed the Duke's men? Had it truly been part of why they wanted her? Josiah Vane, who loved his daughter and had never in his life understood her, beamed with the memory of his own cleverness. "The very thing that clinched it, Nell," he said warmly. "I told you at the time." Their solicitor perked up like a pointer. "A duchess who can run the place," he says to me, "that is worth as much as the gold near enough. His Grace wanted it in the terms, so far as the law would let him, that you would take the household in hand. And haven't you just?" He patted her cheek, proud as a king. "I always said your cleverness would make your fortune, and so it has. Look at you, a duchess, and the saving of them." He meant it as the tenderest thing a father could say. Eleanor smiled and poured his tea, and felt the last small hope go out in her like a pinched candle. It was true. All of it was true. She had not been married. She had been engaged, the way a man engages an agent, and dressed the engagement in a wedding, and the warmth of these bright weeks was the warmth any master feels toward the servant who saves his house. She had been a fool. Worse, she had been a fool with her eyes open, for she had known from the first day exactly what she was to this family, and had let a harvest waltz make her forget it. And there was one who watched Eleanor grow quiet, and understood at once what it might be turned to, and set herself to turn it. Miss Arabella Frost was the daughter of the neighboring estate, beautiful and well-born and possessed, since girlhood, of the settled conviction that she would one day be Duchess of Blackthorne. She had grown up expecting Adrian. She had waited through his father's ruin, certain that in the end blood would call to blood, and then he had married a mill girl for money, and Arabella had never, for 1 hour, forgiven it. Arabella had been at the harvest supper. She had seen the waltz. She had gone home white, with a rage she called by prettier names, and she had watched, all that autumn, the whole county begin to soften toward the clever duchess who had saved Ravenscar, and she had understood that unless she acted, she would spend the rest of her life curtsying to a shopkeeper's daughter. So she found the one true and cruel thing in the whole affair, the very thing Crabbe had planted and Josiah had confirmed. And she did not invent a lie. She had far too fine an instinct for that. She took the truth, and she polished it, and she set it loose in every drawing-room in 3 counties, in a form so elegant that it could not be answered. She never called the Duchess low. That was old and stale. Instead, she called her capable. "One must admire her," Arabella would say, "sweet as cream, over the teacups. Truly, the most competent creature. I hear she keeps the books herself, walks the farms, manages the whole estate. Blackthorne could not have engaged a better agent if he had advertised in the newspapers. And to think he need pay her nothing but her keep. Really, when you consider it, it is the shrewdest bargain the family has made in 100 years. He bought himself the cleverest steward in the north, and got a duchess thrown into the arrangement, all for the price of 1 wedding ring." A pause, a little laugh, a lowering of the lovely eyes. "One does hope she does not tire. Servants who are worked too hard sometimes give notice." It was perfect, because it was almost entirely true, and it flew from drawing-room to drawing-room on wings. The cleverest servant Blackthorne ever engaged. Within a fortnight, the whole county knew the phrase, and it made its way, as such things do, back to Ravenscar, and back at last to Eleanor, who heard in it the exact shape of her own worst midnight thought, spoken now in every mouth in the shire. She was not a wife. She was staff in a coronet. Everyone could see it. Everyone had always seen it. She had been the last to understand the terms of her own marriage. the warmth went out of her. She could not help it. She stopped coming down to the small parlor for supper. She sent word that she was tired. She kept to the east wing and her ledgers, working now, not with the fierce joy of the autumn, but with a cold determination. Because if she was valued as a tool, then very well. She would be the finest tool the estate had ever known, and she would keep her heart in a locked room where no one could get at it to break it a second time. The Duke did not understand. How could he? He knew nothing of Crabbe's parting shot, nothing of Josiah's proud confirmation, nothing of the phrase Arabella had loosed upon the county. He knew only that the woman who had thawed his frozen life had suddenly frozen over herself, that the warmth had gone out of her eyes when he came near, that she answered him now in the same cold, even voice she had used at their wedding dinner. He was a proud man, and an inexperienced one in matters of the heart, and he did the worst possible thing, which was to be proud back. A Blackthorne did not go begging. So he withdrew too, and the great house that had begun, for one bright season, to warm, went cold again, and Lady Cordelia watched it happen with quiet satisfaction, and Arabella Frost, calling often now and always kind, fanned every draught she could reach. The break came, as such things do, in public and at the worst possible time. The estate had recovered enough that year, through Eleanor's management, that the Duke was persuaded, chiefly by Cordelia, to hold a great dinner. The county was to come. The very ladies who had refused the Duchess her card were to sit in the restored dining room and see the restored fortunes of the house, and Cordelia intended it as her triumph, the reassertion of the old family against the vulgar tide of trade. She planned it herself, she wrote the placings herself, and she seated the Duchess, once again, below the salt. Eleanor saw it when she came down. The long table blazed with candles, as it had on her wedding night. The county sat in its silks and its jewels, and her place, her card in Cordelia's own hand, was at the very foot, below the great silver stag, among the poor cousins, exactly as it had been the night she came to this house. Worse than that, as she took her place, she heard, from the fine ladies near the head, the whisper Arabella had made for her, passing behind gloved hands, delighted. There she is, the clever one, the cleverest servant Blackthorne ever engaged. And the whole table's cruelty had a new and unbearable edge, because it was not the old sneer at her low birth which she had learned to bear. It was the naming of her deepest fear aloud, in her own house, before the world. For a moment, the old resolve rose in her, to take the seat and say nothing and outlast them all. But she was so tired. She had saved this house. She had earned this table with her own mind and her own 2 hands, and she had done it, while it scorned her. And here they were, and here was the seat, and here was the whole county gathered to name her a servant to her face. And it mattered. It mattered terribly. And Adrian said nothing. That was the wound that finished it. He came in, and he saw the placing, and Eleanor watched him see it, and she watched him hesitate, and she watched him do exactly what he had done on their wedding night. He looked at his aunt, and he looked at the county, and he took his own seat at the head of the table, and he let it stand. Whether from old cowardice, or from the cold pride he had wrapped around himself since she withdrew, or simply from a moment's failure of nerve before a room full of watching eyes, she never knew, and it made no difference. He had had the chance, before them all, to seat his wife beside him, and he had not taken it. So it was all true after all. That was what she thought, standing there in her fine silk, while the county watched her not sit down. She had made herself indispensable to the estate. She had not made herself dear to the man. She never would. And she understood, in one clear, cold moment, the thing she should have understood on her wedding day, that indispensable was not the same as beloved, that a house may depend upon a woman entirely and honor her not at all, and that she had spent a year building a place for herself in this house, and it was still, and always would be, below the salt. She did not make a scene. She had never in her life made a scene. She simply did not take the seat. She crossed the whole length of that silent staring room to the head of the table where her husband sat, and she stopped beside him, and she said, in a voice pitched low but perfectly clear, so that he alone could hear it, and the whole room could see that something was said, "I have kept your books, and mended your roofs, and caught your thief, and saved your name, and I have heard tonight in your own dining room what I am to you and to all of them, the cleverest servant you ever engaged. I will not sit below your salt to be your servant a second time. I am going home to my father in the morning. You have my leave to engage another. You will find, I think, that agents are more easily replaced than wives, but you never wanted a wife, so it will trouble you very little." And she turned, and she walked out, past Cordelia's frozen smile and Arabella's glittering triumph, and the whole gaping county, with her head high and her back straight, and every candle in the room reflected in her dry and burning eyes. She went up to the east wing, and she rang for Mrs. Halloway, and she began, quite calmly, to pack. The Duke sat at the head of his table for perhaps 10 seconds after she had gone. He would think about those 10 seconds for the rest of his life. He sat there while the county murmured, and Cordelia said something soothing about the volatility of persons not born to society, and Arabella watched him with hungry eyes, and the candles burned. And in those 10 seconds he understood, all at once and entirely too late, 3 things. He understood that he had done it twice, the same cowardice, on the same table, a year apart. He understood the phrase she had thrown at him, the cleverest servant you ever engaged, and where it must have come from. And he saw the whole cruel machinery of it, Crabbe and the county and Arabella's sweet poisoned voice, and worst of all, his own settlement, his own solicitors, the terms he had let them write when he thought her nothing but a purchase. He had, in the beginning, God forgive him, bought her partly for her competence. It had been in his mind, and she had found it out, and no words of his could make it not have been true. And he understood, in the same instant, with a clarity that took the breath from him, that it did not matter in the least, because whatever he had bought a year ago, what he had now was not a steward, and not a saving of the estate, and not a clever agent who came without wages. What he had now was the only person on the earth he could imagine living beside, and he loved her more than his pride and his name and his 400 years of blood, and he had let them call her a servant at his own table, and said nothing, and she was upstairs packing to leave him, because he had never once, in a year, chosen her out loud. He stood up so abruptly that his chair went over backward and crashed upon the floor. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Cordelia's mouth opened, and the Duke of Blackthorne, before the assembled county, before the very ladies whose good opinion he had spent his whole ruined life fearing, did the thing he should have done a year before. "You have heard a clever phrase tonight," he said, and his voice carried to the farthest candle. "I heard it too. The cleverest servant Blackthorne ever engaged. It has been going about the county for a month, I am told, and it came to my own table tonight, and I sat here and let it, as I have sat and let a great many shameful things in this house, that I had the power to stop." He looked down the whole length of the blazing table, at the empty place below the salt, where his aunt had seated the woman who saved them all. "So let me answer it, since I am the only one here with the right to. Yes, when this marriage was made, in my pride and my ruin, I let my solicitors prize her cleverness as a man prizes a good bargain. That is true, and it is the most shameful true thing I know about myself, and she has had to live inside it for a year. But hear the rest, all of you, and carry it back to every drawing-room where that phrase is spoken. Every roof over every tenant on this estate, she mended. Every debt my father left, her mind and her courage cleared. The thief who bled us for 30 years, she caught, alone, at 2 in the morning, while the rest of us slept in our pride. And somewhere in the doing of it, I stopped being a man who had bought a clever woman, and became a man who could not draw a breath worth breathing without her, and I was too proud and too great a coward to tell her so, and so I let you name her a servant in the house she saved. Laugh at that, if you like. Laugh as long as you please. There is only one person alive whose opinion of me I care for, and she is upstairs, and I have wasted a year, and I am going now to beg her, on my knees if she will have it, not to go." And he left them there, the whole county, and his frozen aunt, and the beautiful triumphant Arabella, whose triumph had just turned to ash in her mouth. And he took the stairs to the east wing, 2 at a time. He found her in the middle of a room full of open trunks, folding a plain wool gown, her eyes dry and her hands very steady, which was worse than tears. "Eleanor, there is a coach from the village at 7, she said, not turning. "You need not trouble yourself. I will take nothing that is yours. I will leave the books in order. Your new man will find everything plain. I do not want a new man. I do not want the books in order. I want you to put down that gown, and let me say the thing I should have said a year ago, and have been too great a fool to say." "There is nothing to say." Her voice shook now, at last. "I know what I am here, Adrian. My father told me, in his pride. Crabbe told me, in his spite. The whole county says it over its tea. You did not marry me. You engaged me. You wanted a woman who could hold this house together, and my father sold you one. And everything since, all of it, the dining and the riding out and the barn, has been a master's kindness to a servant who saves him. And I let myself forget it for one waltz, and I will not forget it again. I would rather keep my father's books in Manchester and be no man's clever bargain than stay here and never know whether you want me, or only cannot manage without me." He was quiet a moment, and then he crossed the room, through the open trunks, and he took the wool gown gently out of her hands and set it down, and he did not take her hands, because he saw she could not yet bear to be touched, but he stood very close, and he said the truest thing he had ever said in his life. "You have named the one fear I cannot argue you out of with words," he said, "because it is true that I need you. The estate needs you. Every soul on this land is better for your being here, and if I stood before you and swore I did not need you, you would know I was lying, and you would be right, and you would go, so I will not swear it. I will do the only thing that can prove the difference to a woman as clever as you are, which is this." He drew a breath. "Tomorrow I will send to the market town and engage a steward, a good one, at a fair wage, to keep the books and walk the farms and manage every account of this estate, so that from tomorrow you need never lift a pen for Ravenscar again, unless it pleases you. You may keep the books because you love the doing of it, or you may never look at another ledger as long as you live, and it will make no difference to this house, because the house will be managed without you. I am taking away, Eleanor, the very thing you were bought for. I am making you useless to me. And then, when you are of no more practical value to this estate than any painted miss who faints at a column of figures, when there is nothing left for you to save and no bargain left to serve, I am going to go on wanting you every hour of every day for the rest of my life, and you will have no way left to explain it but the true one." She had gone very still. He pressed on, because he could see it beginning to reach her, the thing behind the words. "And if that is not proof enough," he said, and his voice dropped, "then hear this, and know I mean it to the last acre. I would sell Ravenscar tomorrow. All of it. The hall and the land and the 400 years, every stone your cleverness saved. I would put it all to auction and stand in the ruin of it, a happy man, if the price of keeping it were losing you. I chose this land over my own freedom once, and I have regretted every day of it, until you. I will not choose it over you. You are the one thing in this world I have that was never bought and cannot be sold, because you gave yourself to the saving of a house that owed you nothing, out of nothing but your own great heart, and no settlement my solicitors ever wrote has one word in it that could purchase that. Stay. The word came out of him low and unsteady, a man with nothing left to guard. Not because I need you, God knows I do, but that is the least of it. Stay because I cannot imagine the rest of my life being worth the living of it without you in it. Stay. The rain had begun again against the windows. Soft now, the storm gone gentle. Eleanor looked up at him, at the proud, closed face she had watched thaw across a year, open now entirely, holding nothing back, laid before her without a single defense. And she believed him. That was the thing that undid her. Not the words alone, fine as they were, but that he had just offered to make her useless, which was the one gift no master ever offers a servant, and to sell the very estate her cleverness had saved, which was the one thing no man who valued her for her use could ever bring himself to say. He had reached past every argument in her head and answered the exact shape of the fear, and he could only have done that if he had understood the fear, and he could only have understood it if he had been paying attention to her the whole time, as a person and not a purchase, all along. "You made a terrible spectacle of yourself downstairs," she whispered. "I heard the chair fall." "The most terrible in the history of the county," he agreed. "They will speak of it for 50 years. I told them I would beg you on my knees. I find I am entirely willing to. Shall I?" "No," she said, and her voice broke on it, and the tears came at last, and they were not the kind she had feared. "No, do not kneel. Only do not engage a steward, Adrian. I should be so very bored. I have grown quite fond of catching thieves, and there is no one in this house who can do it half so well as I." He laughed, that rough, unpracticed laugh, and it broke on something like a sob. And Eleanor, Duchess of Blackthorne, who had come to this house sold and scorned and seated below the salt, who had vowed she would rise and had risen and had nearly let the rising cost her the one thing worth having, reached up and drew her husband's head down to hers and kissed him, once, softly, while the rain came gentle off the moor. It was the first time she let it be everything a first time should be, and no more, and he held her as though she were the whole worth of the world, and neither of them thought, in that moment, about a single account in any ledger, anywhere. The life that followed was the slow, ordinary building of a thing, which is the only true marriage there is. Lady Cordelia removed to Bath before the winter, having discovered that a house is a great deal less comfortable when its master no longer fears his aunt, and Ravenscar breathed easier for her going. Arabella Frost married a baronet with a red face and a temper, and was heard to say the Duke had always been a disappointment, and no one who had witnessed the great dinner believed her, and the clever phrase she had made was never spoken in the county again, for it had come, in the end, to mean only how badly she had misjudged them both. Silas Crabbe stood before the magistrate and was found out entirely, for Eleanor's matched receipts left him nowhere to stand, and the tenants he had robbed for 30 years came to the estate office one by one, and the Duchess sat with each of them and set right what could be set right. By the second autumn, the Dawes family up on the high field had a roof that did not leak, and 4 sound cottages stood where the western ruin had been, built for less than half of what a thief had once pretended to spend, and every stone of them, laid by tenants, paid a fair wage from their own Duchess's hand. The Duke did engage a steward, a good one, at a fair wage, exactly as he had promised, so that no soul in 3 counties could ever again call his wife the cleverest servant he had bought. And Eleanor kept the books anyway. She would let no one else near them. But she kept them now, the way a woman keeps a garden she loves, rather than a debt she owes, for the joy of the growing things, and not because any master required it. And that made all the difference in the world, which is a difference only the person doing the keeping can ever truly feel. Josiah Vane visited that spring, and his daughter told him, gently, one evening by the fire, what his proud words at the settlement had nearly cost her. The old man, who had never in his life understood her, and had loved her helplessly all the same, sat a long while with his hands over his face. "I thought I was praising you, Nell," he said at last, thick-voiced. "I thought I was buying you the best place in the world. I never once thought I was telling a man to want you for your usefulness. I am a fool with figures for a heart." And Eleanor, who had a heart with room in it even for a father like that, put her arms around him and forgave him, and the two of them sat by the fire until it burned low, and something between them that had been strained since the day she was sold was mended and made new. The county, which had refused the Duchess her card, discovered within a season that it very much wished to be received at Ravenscar after all, for the house was prosperous and lively and warm, and there was no better dinner in 3 counties. Cards began to arrive, addressed, most correctly, to Her Grace. Eleanor received them all with a serene good humour that gave no one the satisfaction of a triumph, and cost no one the sting of a snub. And the ladies who had sneered came to her table and ate her excellent dinners, and went home wondering how they had ever thought her common, or clever, or anything at all but exactly what a duchess ought to be. And the table. The great long table at Ravenscar, where the candles burned 200 strong on the night a mill owner's daughter was seated below the salt in her own house, remained. But on the night of the first restored dinner after the reconciliation, the whole county watching, the Duke of Blackthorne took the silver stag, the great salt cellar that had marked her banishment, and moved it with his own 2 hands to a side table, out of the way, where it might hold salt and mark no one's place ever again. And he seated his duchess at his right hand, where she remained. But that is not the last image, and the last image is the one that matters, so I will give it to you plainly. It is a dawn some 2 years on. Grey light is coming up over the moor, the far blue hills waking one by one, and in the estate office at the end of the stone passage a single candle still burns, though it is hardly needed now. Eleanor sits at the great oak table with the ledgers open before her, a smudge of ink upon her cheek, exactly where it was the night he first found her, running her finger down a column of honest figures, her lips moving as she reckons, wholly and joyfully absorbed, keeping the books that no one requires her to keep, for the pure love of the doing. And the Duke of Blackthorne stands in the doorway in his shirt-sleeves, a cup of coffee in each hand, and he does not speak, because he has learned that these dawns belong to her, and he would not break them for the world. He only stands and watches his wife at her work in the growing light, the woman who was sold to save his house and stayed to become its heart, and he thinks, as he thinks every single morning, that he is the most fortunate man in England. She looks up, she sees him, and she smiles, that fierce private smile that once lit her face over a stolen ledger at 2 in the morning, and she says, "You are staring at me, Your Grace." And he crosses the room and sets a cup of coffee at her elbow, and bends and kisses the ink smudge on her cheek, and says the thing he has waited 2 years to give back to her, the answer to a question she once asked him in a barn full of harvest light. "Adrian," he says softly, "when we are alone, it is Adrian, and I find, my love, that I still cannot seem to stop." "Adrian," she says, and the light comes up gold and copper over the moor, and the candle burns down to nothing, no longer needed, no longer required by anyone, kept only because she wished to keep it, and the two of them bend together over the books, the Duke and the Duchess who found, against every wall the world could build and every doubt it could plant, the one person each of them could not do without, and would not sell, and would never trade, for all the land in England, not below the salt, not any longer. Side by side, at last, and for good.